I'd like to welcome you to today's event. My name is Andy Newman. I'm a psychoanalyst and a member of the Site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis, which has organised today's event in co-collaboration with Eck Norton, and of course is part of a series. You've missed part 1, but you are in luck because part 3 is going to be quite something. It's on sorcery and trance, and it's on the 22nd of February, so do book a ticket. Just one thing to say about the site, we're in our 20th year, and I think what we're aiming to do with a series like this is to continue to push at the boundaries of psychoanalysis and, the boundaries of psychoanalysis, and be open and in conversation with discourses of contemporary world. So I'm going to now hand over to Ed.
Okay, thank you. So this afternoon, we're going to listen to 3 presentations, each of which are going to offer a different perspective on the relationship between madness, psychotherapy, and political resistance. I'm hoping that that's going to lead on to a frank discussion about the political implications of the psychoanalytic encounter and of psychotherapy more generally. So some kind of questions we might want to keep in mind are: who does psychoanalysis help? How does psychoanalytic theory account for the prevalence of particular pathologies among certain demographic or social groups? Are the structures of the psychoanalytic session designed to support or to suppress the possibility of political resistance? What is the relationship between those who resist the social expectations that are put on them to conduct themselves in a normal way, and those who resist the political institutions that maintain the status quo? So to start our conversation today, we have Sally Sales. Sally's been a psychotherapist for over 25 years and has a background in both humanistic and psychoanalytic therapy. She's currently a visiting research fellow at the University of West of England, undertaking 2 research projects around class. The first, which will be published in a book later in 2018, explores the relationship between psychoanalysis and working class experience, while the second assesses the role of class in the formation of both parenting and identity in adoptive family life. Sally previously coordinated the site's training in London before setting up the site's sister training in Truro and Cornwall. Sally's going to speak today about a research study of clinical work with working class people within the context of the site's clinic in Cornwall. She will also consider the differences between political resistance and psychoanalytic resistance, and the place of class within this difference. After that, we're going to hear from Mohammed Rashid. Mohammed's a philosopher of psychiatry, interested in the boundaries of illness, the diagnostic processes in psychiatry, empathy and understanding in schizophrenia, and the phenomenology of delusions and hallucinations. His most recent work examines aspects of the philosophy and politics of identity and recognition in light of contemporary mental health activism such as mad pride. This research will be published in his book, Madness and the Demand for Recognition. Mohammed is also a medical doctor with training in psychiatry. Today, he will ask what drives people to seek the kind of social change that we see today in mad activism or trans activism. What drives people to struggle for recognition and to resist existing patterns of representation and value of their identities? And finally, what role can psychoanalytic therapy play in alerting people to the oppressive aspects of their situation without itself contributing to their ideological manipulation? So we're going to hear those 2 talks. Then we're going to have a short interruption in which the artist Adam Gallagher, who's at the front here, is going to be reading a short piece of his writing. After that, we're going to have our final paper, which is from Anthony Faramelli. Anthony's a lecturer at both Brighton University and Kingston University. He also works as a mental health support worker in the role of a recovery coordinator at the London charity Single Homeless Project. His work focuses on philosophies of resistance, group analysis, post-colonial theory, and institutional psychotherapy. His forthcoming book is titled Revolution, Resistance and Fascism, Zapatismo and Assemblage Politics. This afternoon, Anthony's going to talk about practice called institutional psychotherapy or institutional analysis. He's going to speak about Franz Fanon's approach to social therapy, and I hope argue that the problem of the program of radical reforms Fanon instituted at the Ville de Jonville Psychiatric Hospital in Algeria enacted a therapeutically grounded practice of both anti-racist and anti-colonial resistance. Okay, so this is going to be a lot. The idea is that we will not have questions at the end of each one. We'll have each paper for about 20 minutes each, and then at the end we'll have time for a discussion, questions and a discussion in the room. On that note, the only other thing I want to say is that we are recording the event. If during the discussion you say something which you would prefer not to be recorded, then afterwards it can be taken out, anything like that, so don't feel like it. Don't feel held back by the recording. And at that point, I'm going to pass over to Sally. Yeah, we'll move this here.
Okay. I want to begin this presentation with one of my favourite quotations from Foucault. Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover who we are, but to refuse what we are. We have to promote new forms of subjectivity through the refusal of this kind of individuality, which has been imposed on us for several centuries. So Foucault's clarion call for resistance to and refusal of Western individualism seems to me as relevant now as when Foucault wrote this back in 1982. Indeed, we might say in the intervening 30 or so years, as neoliberalism has intensified its project, that individualism has become a more entrenched form of governance, generating what some commentators have referred to as wasted humans, the casualties of this kind of regime. Now, for me, clearly neoliberalism is a class project, promoting a form of individuality that is middle class in the freedoms, opportunities, and choices it promotes. However, one of its greatest achievements in contemporary times is getting those who are most disadvantaged by its economic policies, the working classes, to support it. So in this paper, I want to think about what role psychoanalysis can play in helping resist this contemporary technology of individualism. For Foucault, psychoanalysis was too embedded in the conditions of its production in Western regimes of power to ever be a space of transformation. This paper will consider that critique and ask, do the theories and practices of psychoanalysis transmit and uphold technologies of middle-class subjectivity? So with working class experience as my specific focus, there will be two parts to the presentation. The first part will draw on some of the work of Judith Butler to think about the contemporary field of class and the place of psychoanalysis within it. And the second part will look at a research study of psychoanalytic work with working class people to think about what happens when working class experience encounters the psychoanalytic clinic. So as a way of introducing the first part of the presentation, I want to think about something that happened a few years back in the summer of 2015 during the refugee crisis. It was a photograph of the drowned refugee child washed up on a European beach that sparked shock and outrage in the UK and an upsurge in sympathy and empathy for the refugees and migrants travelling to Europe. I want to think about why that image worked to capture public attention when the images of drowned adult refugees, which had been in the press on numerous occasions, did not generate the same outcry. Clearly, these adults were not recognised as humans who should be mourned. Yet the child of these adults is a human that we did recognise and who we actively wanted to do something about. I think this image of the child signified in some quite important and foundational ways that go to the heart of what I understand to be the contemporary crisis with Western individualism. There is the utter vulnerability of the child's body, the precarity of the child's situation, and the failure of its dependency on the adult world. This image clearly broke through the individuality of the adult self. We simply do not put borders around the child in the same way. Indeed, we might say the child does not have the same borders anyway and inhabits the world in a less bordered way. What I want to emphasise here is the important difference between adult and child states. which centres around the relinquishment of the porous body of childhood in order for adulthood to be accomplished. This relinquishment involves the disavowal of some very important experiences that are bound up with child states: dependency, vulnerability, and precarity. It is, I'm arguing, in the West, much more permissible to allow these states in children than in adults, hence the inability to mourn the adult refugee. Indeed, we could say there is a disavowal of the precarity and vulnerability of the adult refugee, a disavowal that can be seen in representations of them as scroungers and opportunistic freeloaders. Butler, in her most recent book, draws parallels between the porous body of infancy and contemporary concerns with permeable borders. She says, "The language of permeability became very important in the United States after 9/11, referring to the permeability of national borders, drawing upon the anxieties of being entered against one's will, the invasion of bodily boundaries." And she goes on to say, "The permeability of the body is a condition that can only be managed, but not escaped." She's suggesting there's something here about our beginnings that remain irreducible in our adult selves, a founding vulnerability, an open border with the other that has to be resisted or defended against in adult life. For Butler, Western individualism is disastrously predicated upon a disavowal of what she refers to as this irrecoverable relationality and a non-narrativizable exposure. So in other words, a disavowal of a self that is formed for a borderless type of another. Now, this resistance to vulnerability and precarity is not simply a technology of individualism, it's a form of governance in the West. Certain communities are abjected and excluded precisely because of the precarity and vulnerability of their lives. Migrants, welfare recipients, the homeless, the unemployed, refugees, travellers. We live in a culture that functions by an exclusion of these precarious others. Indeed, many commentators have made the point that the neoliberal state functions through the generation of excluded communities who are then scapegoated or targeted as dangers to and drains upon the nation. We could say that Western individualism is in a relation of resistance to its own vulnerabilities and social ties. Related to this is one of the most destructive and disabling characteristics of contemporary life, the individualising of the social. There is now the view that class as a social structuring is irrelevant to how a person progresses or not in their life. Everyone, if they work hard, can get on and achieve, and we all now bear an enormous responsibility for the lives we lead. So it's not poverty or disadvantage that's holding people back, it's their poor self-management. So by situating failure as personal and not social, it has become much more difficult to recognise and so resist the forms of inequality and injustice that contemporary class stratification produces. So what role does psychoanalysis play in helping contemporary subjects resist this pernicious and oppressive formation of contemporary individuality? It has been commonly documented that psychoanalysis emergence in late 19th century capitalism made class and psychoanalysis co-joined and complicit practices. The concentration on the middle-class Oedipal family takes many different theoretical forms, but this foundation has never really been dislodged. Most psychoanalytic accounts describe a divided and alienated subjectivity, a split familial subject, driven by an unconscious life of repressed affects, desires, or prohibitions, which therapy will sublimate, domesticate, in the interest of accommodation to a wider social order. So can psychoanalysis ever be an experience of resistance, particularly for working class subjects? I want to briefly conclude this section by looking at some of Butler's work in Psychic Life of Power, where her use of Foucault offers a way to re-theorise the class conservatism of psychoanalysis and make it more of an experience of resistance to class subjugation. In the chapter I'm referring to, her argument with Lacan is that resistance to the normalisation of identity that lies at the heart of psychic life, Lacan consigned to an imaginary order that will always remain subservient to the law, to the symbolic. Foucault's concept of power, in contrast, re-theorises resistance as a potential break in the law. So rather than a dual system of unconscious and conscious, where the unconscious is resistant to but powerless, Foucault conceptualises power as working through and across the law, and where resistance is an effect of the very power that it is said to oppose. She captures this double movement of power in Foucault very well, Butler. It forms the subject, but it also provides the possibility of the subject's own subversion. So how does this resistance to power work? Butler, reworking Foucault, says resistance appears in two ways: reverse discourse and convergence with other discursive regimes. I just want to look at these two processes of resistance in terms of how we could imagine working classness in the psychoanalytic clinic. So taking reverse discourse first. Working class people arrive in the clinic with negative or injurious identities. These identities are given space and legitimation, and through the articulation of them, the patient reverses this injurious trajectory. So much like Foucault's homosexual, the patient uses her or his injurious identity as a resource in its remaking. Second, the idea of discursive complexity. Regimes of class normalisation work to produce very singular class identities. However, for Foucault, power doesn't simply form us in a singular way, but is malleable, multiple, and convergent with other regimes. So working class people arrive in the clinic with narrow and one-dimensional views of themselves, but the many stories they tell undermine the singularity of class identity, allowing more complicated and non-integrated versions of their lives. But Butler asks an important question. What about our attachment, unconscious attachment to the dominant forms of individuality? How are these overthrown? Following Foucault, she sees the attachment to subjection as a necessary resource in its overthrow. It's only by occupying fully those subjective attachments that they can be resignified. Now, of course, if psychoanalysis is in a state of resistance to its own class constitution, then radicalising the clinic in these ways is quite impossible. So with these thoughts in mind, I want to conclude with some extracts from interviews with psychotherapists working in a low-cost psychoanalytic clinic to get a sense of what happens when working classness encounters psychoanalysis. The clinic was set up under the auspices of the site in 2011 in a rural county against the backdrop of the coalition government's programme of austerity. It offers 2 years, twice-weekly analysis to people who would otherwise not be able to afford to access such therapy, and the fee is set according to what people can pay, even if this is very minimal. Most of the people who come to the clinic are from working class backgrounds and have the complications of poor, insecure housing, poverty, social isolation, unemployment, all of which have complex effects on their mental health. I will begin with a comment that is often made when mental health professionals refer working class people to the clinic. This person is not psychologically minded. So here, the difference of a working class life is turned into a deficient subjectivity, making them unsuitable for a therapeutic encounter. So the following extracts explore what happens when this difference encounters psychoanalysis. So whilst the clinic operates as a private service, all the therapists I interviewed were clear how differently working class people related to the service compared to middle class people in private therapy. It was clear that a lot of working class people came to the clinic for mental health services and were, in the words of one therapist, passive and docile, accustomed to having a life governed by an outside other with little agency of their own. One therapist drew attention to how this lack of agency operates transferentially in the clinic. Rather than asking, is the therapy helping me, the question is more like, am I doing okay with this psychoanalytic stuff? One therapist understood this as the operation of the medical model, where the working class patient sees you an expert, and you have an understanding of what is wrong with them and can sort them out. Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence speaks to what's being described here. He developed the concept to show how modes of cultural domination operate unconsciously. Class relations are structured to produce working class and middle class communities that agree that the middle class is a superior. In the clinical examples, we can see this operating as working class people accept and defer to the authority of the middle class clinic. Now, of course, middle class patients often feel without agency in the psychoanalytic encounter, and psychoanalysis would understand this as a transferential effect. Across its various traditions, psychoanalysis sees the clinical setting as reproductive of the power relations of early nurture, where we're all once subject to the field of our parents' desire. However, this founding precarity is differentially experienced according to what Butler describes as norms of recognition. This means that for a working class person, they will enter the clinical encounter already inscribed into a socially less valuable and socially more precarious position, which will foundationally shape how they relate to the therapist. Some of the therapists saw referral to the clinic as a last hope by the statutory services, where a lot of people acquired intractable mental health disorders. The disorder becomes a form of recognition in a culture which has, through its exclusionary practices, disenfranchised these people's lives. An identity formed through injury is the consequence, and one that is clung to as one of the only socially viable identities available to clinic users. This raises an important question about whether the exclusions of class stratification make troubled psychic states more likely in working class subjects. Related to this, many of the therapists agreed that there was an often expressed demand for diagnosis amongst clinic users, in marked distinction to middle class patients whose individuality would be offended by such labelling. It has to also be said that getting better for some clinic users was an economically dangerous outcome, as they would lose the benefits and housing support on which they depended. Does this mean that such an injurious identity can never be a resource in its overthrow? There was little sense from the therapists that working class people wanted a therapy space for talking, although over time this clearly developed. One therapist described this very well. The idea of coming to analysis to talk, that's a luxury. It's need, not desire, for the people I see. Two of her working class patients came therefore with very practical demands around help with letters to a range of different authorities. This would not be a demand that middle class patients would commonly make. One therapist captured the difference very well. Middle class people want to improve their individuality, their visibility, to be a someone, and separation from family is an informing frame of reference. A number of therapists drew attention to the differences between middle class and working class family life. Middle class people are raised to look outside the family of their achievements and to expect wider society to be in support with their ambitions. Working class people mostly do not have these ambitions. They have very low expectations of what is possible for them, and they tend to stay in their communities and not to separate. Now, the achievement of separation occupies a foundational place in most psychoanalytic accounts. Disorders of separation, like borderline personality disorder, have become an increasing mental health concern, with therapies like mentalisation rolled out within the NHS, their clear target, usually working class people. One therapist linked the lack of social recognition for working class experience with what she describes as the enmeshed relations of working class family. These relations are a support against the lack of recognition in the cultural field. So two questions seem very important to pose here. Is achieving separation and acquiring borders a form of middle class individualism? And do the exclusions and hierarchies of class make borderline states more likely in working class people? How am I doing with time?
That's a very good question, because I've been looking at it right at the start. I think go through what you've got.
I'm nearly at the end. Most of the therapists saw class as implicitly present throughout the therapy, but there was a general agreement that class was rarely explicitly cited. One therapist sees this as a success of the social project of identity politics, which she understands has done a good job of eradicating class and convincing people it is down to them. They're responsible for themselves. This therapist was quite passionate about how recent government welfare changes comes directly into the clinical work. Bedroom tax, changes in benefit, all of these have a huge impact on the therapy. And as she said, working class people cannot just fall back into the internal self and reflect upon themselves. This therapist is drawing a sharp comparison between middle class and working class lives in therapy. For many clinic users, managing the challenges of their material existence is the clinical work, and prevents the more dreamlike, free associative space that the traditional psychoanalytic encounter provides. I think one of the issues for me here is that the traditional psychoanalytic frame is very much set up across a culture of abstinence and deprivation. The therapist is not to gratify the patient, but to stir up longing, desire, or frustration, depending on the particular school, so that foundational experiences from early life are encountered transferentially and worked through. But what if, like many working class clinic users, deprivation, frustration, and fabric of material as well as psychic life, and having desire or longing is actually completely pointless? So, to conclude, whilst all the therapists had a great deal to say about class in the clinic, accounting for that within psychoanalytic theory was profoundly difficult, as if there was an irreconcilable gap between the lives of working class people and what they brought as those lives, and the psychoanalytic theories used to account for those lives.
Thank you very much. I'm sure people have lots of things to say, but let's hold on to them. And we'll hear next from Mohammed. Are you ready?
Ready, thank you. So, let's start with a question. Why do people struggle for recognition? Why is it that certain groups in society demand social change in the way their identities are thought to represent and valued? This is not a purely theoretical question, of course. We see such demands all around us. We see it quite visibly today in trans activism, and we also see it in mental health activism, which is the focus of my research. But today I want to speak in more general terms. So why do people struggle for recognition? The immediate answer that comes to mind is to say that people are not content with the way they are being treated by others, that they consider themselves to be denied a fundamental measure of social freedom, the freedom to decide who they want to be or just to be themselves, or that they are not being treated with the respect that they believe they are owed. Now, these are all fine answers to the question, but these still leave the main issue addressed, which is the motivation for recognition. So if we grant that people struggle for recognition because they want a measure of social freedom to be themselves, from where does this want, this motivation arise? So there are four possible sources of motivation for recognition. There is a metaphysical source, an empirical source, an emotional source connected to the empirical, and finally an ideological source. I'll say a very few words about the first three, and then I'll focus on the third. So the first source of motivation is what I refer to as metaphysical. In accordance with this kind of source, the struggle for more equal and mutual relations of recognition is driven forward by, we can say, the telos of human nature, which is, go along with me, the actualization of freedom. Something like this account is evident in some readings of Hegel's writings on the process of recognition, though it is not the only possible interpretation of Hegel's work on the concept. But of course, this is the view that it is very hard for us to accept today. Apart from certain religious traditions, no one really believes that human beings have an ultimate telos. It strikes us as an unjustified essentialist claim. It's the kind of metaphysical theorizing that Kant's critical philosophy had put to rest in the history of Western philosophy. So I won't be saying anything anymore about the metaphysical source of the motivation for recognition. The second source is what I refer to as empirical, which stands here in distinction to the metaphysical. It is empirical in the sense that it has to do with our psychological nature of human beings. In his book, The Struggle for Recognition, Axel Honneth provides such an account by helping himself to the empirical social psychology of George Mead, which I'm sure many people here know what it is better than me. But I'll summarize it briefly. According to Mead, the self develops out of the interaction of two perspectives. The me, which is the internalized perspective of the social norms of the generalized other, and the I, which is a response to the me and the source of individual creativity, rebellion against social norms. So there is some sort of innate impulse to individuation, and this impulse, it shows up continually the limitations of social norms and motivates an expansion of relations of recognition. But this account, whether it's true or not, is unsatisfactory, as Axel Honneth himself later came to argue. This is a quote from one of his later papers. He says, "I have counted out whether Mead's views can actually be understood as contributions to a theory of recognition. In essence, what Mead calls recognition reduces to the act of reciprocal perspective taking without the character of the other's actions being of any crucial significance. The psychological mechanism by which shared meanings and norms emerge seems to me to generally develop independently of the reactive behavior of the two participants, so that it also becomes impossible to distinguish actions according to their respective normative character." In other words, what Mead describes, this is me now, not Honneth, is a general process that is always already occurring behind people's backs. It's a basic feature of, let's say, the human psychology, the human life form. So Mead explains how shared norms emerge and why they expand, but deprives agents' behavior towards each other of normative significance. They become unwitting subjects of this kind of process rather than agents struggling for recognition. For the key point here is this: to struggle for recognition is to perceive oneself to be denied a status that one is worthy of. It is not to mechanically act out one's innate nature. And this remains the case even if our treatment by others creates a feeling of disrespect or humiliation. So to experience humiliation is to already consider oneself deserving of a certain kind of treatment, of a normative status that is being denied. So these kind of emotions cannot themselves constitute the motivation for recognition. Rather, they are symptoms of the prior existence of a conviction that one must be treated in a better way, in a certain way. So, if the motivation for recognition cannot be accounted for metaphysically by the teleology of social existence, of human nature, and it cannot be accounted for empirically by the facts of one's psychological nature, or emotionally by the powerful feelings that signal the need for social change, then it must somehow be explained with reference to the ideas that together make up the theory and the discourse of recognition. Ideas like specific understandings of individuality, self-realization, freedom, authenticity, social dependence, the need for social confirmation, and notions like dignity, esteem, and distinction, among others. In this sense, to be motivated to struggle for recognition is to already be shaped by historical tradition, where such notions have become part of how we relate to ourselves and others, and the normative expectations that structure such relations. So to put it in one sentence, we are motivated by these notions insofar as we are already constituted socially, so as to be moved by them. Now, putting the issue in this way does raise some concerns. So if we ground the motivation for recognition in the subject's prior socialization, it becomes harder to establish whether that motivation is ultimately a means for the individual to broaden their social freedom, or a means for reproducing existing relations of domination. So Lois McNay writes that, quote, "The desire for recognition might be far from a spontaneous and an innate phenomenon, but the effect of a certain ideological manipulation of individuals." Axel Honneth provides a number of examples where recognition may be seen as contributing to the domination of individuals. Quote, "The pride that Uncle Tom feels as a reaction to the constant praises of his submissive virtues makes him into a compliant servant in a slave-owning society. The emotional appeals to the good mother and housewife made by churches, parliaments, or the mass media over the centuries cause women to remain trapped within a self-image that most effectively accommodated gender-specific division of labor." End quote. So instead of resulting in moral progress in the sense of an expansion of individual freedom, if you like, recognition becomes a mechanism by which people endorse the identities that limit their freedom. These recognition for these identities, and in this way, voluntarily take on tasks or duties that actually serve society. So it seems then that there is a need to distinguish two things here. Distinguish these kind of ideological forms of recognition from relations of recognition in which genuine moral progress can be said to have occurred, since clearly we are after relations of the second sort. So how do we distinguish ideological from, let's call it, genuine recognition? Let's accept the distinction for now. The first problem in drawing this distinction is that they both, on the face of it, they both look identical to each other. Both are forms of recognition, and in each case, the person must feel valued and consider that the social relations in which they are engaged to be conducive to their freedom and to their well-being. So the experience of the subject cannot necessarily help us here, at least at this point. So given these observations, we can define ideological recognition as practices that are intrinsically positive and affirmative, yet bear the negative features of an act of willing subjection, even though these practices appear to lack such discriminatory features. How can these ideological acts of recognition be identified? So the key seems to lie in this idea of willing subjection, and in the possibility of identifying this despite a person's affirmation that they're actually quite alright, thank you very much. This kind of judgment then must somehow be made by someone else, obviously, by an external observer. The observer needs to perceive subjection, while at the same time explaining away the person's acceptance of the situation as an indication that they have internalized the repression in such a way that they willingly subject themselves. Going again to the example that Hannes used, the case of the good mother is an example for this sort of argument. The idea is, for somebody who would advance this kind of argument, would say that by voluntarily endorsing that role, she remains uncompensated for her work, and many other opportunities in life would be foreclosed to her. Now, the observer who makes this kind of argument at this point is no longer concerned with the nature of the interpersonal relationships or with the subject's experience of freedom and well-being. What is at issue seems to be that the observer disagrees with the kind of values and the kind of beliefs that structure those relations and those identities. In fact, we don't need to think of hypothetical examples. I mean, there's something that has been quite visible in sort of not particularly enlightened public discourse and in the media in France and partly in the UK, has to do with the idea that women who cover their hair, who wear hijab, are oppressed. Frequently, people who make those claims do not require the women in question report any oppression. And hence, something like internalized oppression is usually invoked to explain the absence of a negative experience. Of course, some people who cover their hair in this way, who wear hijab, are coerced into doing so, and they would remove it if they were given the right context. They would see it as unnecessary opposition on them. For others, it's about modesty and has religious connotations. That's what they would say. They would not see it as a symbol of their oppression, and we even regard it as a feature that can generate positive recognition, as perhaps a pious person. So, an observer who claims that the desire for recognition in this case is ideological, that women who dress in this way, who cover their hair in this way, are willingly, yet subconsciously, subjecting themselves to existing norms, is really making a statement about his or her views on the cultural context, say. The problem the observer has is with the religious weight placed in clothing, or the fact that it is mainly women who have to observe such practices. Some women who wear the hijab reject this account, since it bypasses their own understanding of what they're doing, the value they attach to it. Not surprisingly, the exact claim is made in reverse by some people who argue that those who dress immodestly are oppressed by a culture that subtly forces them to show their bodies. And those who believe that dressing in this way is an expression of freedom and secularism, the argument can continue, have simply internalized the values by which they willingly subject themselves to existing norms. Now, the point in presenting this case from both sides is to point out that once we bypass people's accounts of what they are doing and put aside their reported experience of freedom and well-being, we can see more clearly that what is going on is in conflict between two different worldviews, if you like. I mean, the conflict itself can be described within the framework of misrecognition from both sides as a continued devaluing of other people's identities under the cover of an interest in their well-being. Now, of course, people are not always right about what they are doing. And our psychological depth is such that we can deceive ourselves and accept an abusive situation. we might not even be able to see that it is abuse. We may convince ourselves that a particular role is exactly right for us, whereas others can see that it's obviously limiting our lives. But psychological depth and the possibility of self-deception go both ways. If that person over there is not transparent to himself, then neither am I, even if transparency admits of degrees. So if we are going to make the argument that a person is willingly subjecting himself, we also need to, in some sense, account for our motivations in making such an argument and what we are, in a sense, getting out of it in terms of validating our worldview, our take on what matters. Now, this perspective on the notion of willing subjection is not a call for inaction. It is essentially simply pointing out that we need to be more personalizing and contextualizing when we do some sort of moral and political analyses and responses of the lives of other people. So, of course, in this sense, sweeping judgments that take the form of group X or coalition X are oppressed are not helpful. There are all sorts of possibilities here, and the only way to sort these out is to kind of be aware of this complexity without losing sight of structural discrimination in a particular community. So if we keep this in mind, we'll find that the spectrum of oppression can include the following. Some in group X are oppressed and already fighting to change that. Some do not consider themselves oppressed, but change their take on the situation once they are presented with a different analysis of it. Some do not consider themselves oppressed, despite clear evidence to the contrary, yet no amount of persuasion can get them to see that. Some consider your interest in their freedom as an attempt to oppress them. Now, that being said, alerting someone to what we deem to be the oppressive aspects of their life is sometimes necessary. Sometimes we can genuinely imagine a better life and a better future for other people, and we cannot simply ignore this. The problem is that we need to be aware at the same time that our interest in their well-being is not in some way an attempt to impose some sort of worldview on them. How do we get about doing that, and does psychoanalytic therapy have a role to play in this? So, just to remind ourselves of the basic nature of the thing we're trying to achieve here. The first point is this: so we have individuals whom we perceive to be oppressed or limited by the social relations in which they are engaged. The second point is that these persons do not perceive this. They consider themselves to be sufficiently satisfied and empowered. And the question is, how do we alert them to what we see to be a problem with their situation without imposing our worldview on them and without manipulating them? This is the conundrum, if you like, that we need to solve. And my question is whether psychoanalysis can contribute as a solution. Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst, sorry to say that, nor am I an expert on the intricacies of psychoanalytic theory and concepts. But perhaps this much I can state. Like all cultural achievements, psychoanalysis has a history and a context in which it was developed and continues to develop. Psychoanalytic culture is transmitted from analyst to analyst, and what is transmitted is really distinctive hermeneutic discipline with many different kinds of schools. Psychoanalysis also promotes certain values, such as the importance of confronting one's painful psychological realities, and other values to do with the primacy of individual autonomy, both theoretically and in terms of therapeutic encounter. So this is our timekeeping, isn't it?
Yeah.
Psychoanalysis also operates with various models of mind that includes the basic concepts of mind, the relation of these concepts to each other, the origin of our drives, and of course the concept of the unconscious itself. As students of psychological anthropology would say, psychoanalysis presupposes a distinctive cultural psychology, which of course is not the only possible one. Different communities and traditions of thought have their own cultural psychologies, and these can be markedly different. All of this suggests that psychoanalysis does not offer an uncontroversial starting point for critique. Even though psychoanalysis is a highly self-reflective practice, and psychoanalysts more than any other practitioners are alert to what they bring to the encounter. The issue is that the conceptual and theoretical bedrock of psychoanalysis, the bedrock that allows self-reflection, allows analysis and critique, is value-laden and culturally unique. In addition to this, many psychoanalytic concepts go behind the subject's experience. The use of concepts like repression, resistance, and again the unconscious itself raise the prospect that the person is being manipulated in a certain way. In fact, one way in which we can view psychedelic therapy, in a positive sense I mean this, is the skillful, extended, subtle manipulation of the subject, conducted for the purpose of increasing self-understanding, improving relationships, and for helping with complex psychological problems. And so manipulation is not necessarily a bad thing. But for the purpose of what we are considering here, which is to alert individuals to the oppressive aspects of the situation, this kind of manipulation will not do. On one hand, it risks spilling over into an imposition of our worldview on them. On the other hand, if psychedelic therapy is successful in alerting individuals to the oppressive aspects of the situation, then that achievement is no different to the problem we initially wanted to act against. What I mean is this: if our starting premise is that the person before us has been ideologically manipulated to endorse an identity, then surely the solution cannot be that we open their eyes to this by ideologically manipulating them again. So, as you can see, I'm skeptical whether psychoanalysis can play an impartial, non-manipulative, progressive role in promoting political subjectivity and political resistance. But my skepticism is of sort of a gentle variety, open to be convinced otherwise. Thank you.
As an interruption in the kind of speaking from the table, we're going to have some speaking from standing up.
I hope I get a balloon though, innit?
Yeah. There's a microphone here if you want it. I have another one, but
Now, can everyone hear me? This one's called, I'm reading from one of my pamphlets, it's a new one. It's called Special Category Status. Spoken in a thick Northern Irish accent. West Belfast or Derry. What we need most of all in this struggle in Northern Ireland is the patience to pursue these problems one by one in a detailed fashion. We need the energy, we need the time, we need the men, we need the money to pursue all these human rights issues through from one after another. The British are always trying to stay back and hope that the Irish will, and that the Celtic community particularly, will be worn down by one indignity and one inequity after another until they finally wear them out and agree to whatever settlement John Ball wants to put on top of them. Father Dennis Ball. This is called SEE, Self-Described Ethnicity Code. Asian or British Asian, A. A1, Indian. A2, Pakistani. A3, Bangladeshi. A9, any other Asian background. Black or black British, B. B1, Caribbean. B2, African. B9, any other black background. Chinese or other ethnic group, 0 or O. 01, Chinese. 09, any other ethnic group. Mixed M. M1, white and black Caribbean. M2, white and black African. M3, white and Asian. M9, any other mixed background. White, W. W1, British. W2, Irish. W9, any other white origin. Rehash version. This one's hard to read. Hard work. It was hard work, you know what I mean? I had to keep my head down in there, be on my best fucking behaviour, not put a foot wrong. Do you know what I mean? I've got family, I've got kids, I've got to stay focused and that's it. I'm good, man, I'm here. Mate, they're never. It's mad not having a release date, innit? It makes no sense. I've been to prison before and I've always had a release date, and this time it was like, when am I coming out? It's been 2 years late. I was supposed to be out in 2012. That was when my parole ended. And that was when IPP was ended as well. But all that didn't happen, not due to any bad behaviour, but just due to the processes. It's slow inside. And all these courses we need, they ain't there. They're not provided. No support. Really. Yeah, it's hard for all the brothers, it's hard. It's hard not having a date. Everyone just wants to get home. Do you know what I mean? That's something to look forward to. And doing the IPP is fucked. I did double when I was the lucky one. Some of the others done an extra 5, 6, 7, and then some. And they all still locked. Every single one of them don't know when they're going to leave. Some of them haven't even done anything. They don't deserve it at all. It's fucked. It messes with you, degrades you. There's depression, anger. It's messed everyone up. Them and their families too, waiting and waiting. It's worse than doing life. But at least then, you know. Yeah, it's true. I know it's a lot, but at the same time, it is what it is. I'm not planning to commit no crimes. 29 years old, not planning to do anything. It's going to put me back in prison. But you know there's restrictions. We're going overseas, certain other things that bother me, but it is what it is. I did it to myself realistically. Do you know what I'm saying? But obviously, I hear that after 10 years, you know, good behaviour, you can get off this licence and appeal. But I'm guilty as this charge, mate, so it's going to be hard work for me. Well, to be honest, I wasn't ready for it. I thought I was ready, but actually I weren't ready in it. There was a lot going on, man. My kids, they're big boys now. When I left, they were kids, and now they're big, grown. So I've got a lot of responsibility. But yeah, man, I'm just out here working hard on my music, supporting my family. Blessed. That's it. That's why I don't give a fuck about me.
So finally, stealing himself a moment, we have Anthony Paramelli.
Right, thank you. The quite nice thing about giving the paper last, especially when you're typically as disorganized as I am, means that I can try to alter what I was going to present to speak to both Mohammed and Sally's paper a bit more, perhaps. The idea of resistance within psychoanalysis, for anyone who's trained within a kind of psychoanalytic framework, the word resistance is almost triggering, right? You're taught, you know, that your patient will always resist you. You know, how do you work through your patient's resistance? So what I want to give here is focus very much on a history of a discipline that is not psychoanalytic per se, but was very much informed by psychoanalysis and very much focused on the notion of resistance. And this history belongs to what's referred to as institutional psychotherapy or institutional analysis. Really, you can call it all institutional analysis, but at the beginning stages, the focus was psychotherapy. So what I'm going to do is briefly give you a bit of a history on this, and then focus on whom I think is the most significant figure in this movement. That's Franz Fanon, and the way that he took a very psychoanalytically informed practice and then moved this into an overt form of political resistance. And then, in a kind of brief attempt to speak to my fellow papers, I'm going to think through notions of recognition, you know, from Fanon, and as well as a lot of the work that's built on Fanon, especially in the area of indigenous resistance. And a little bit, hopefully I'll have time to also speak a bit to the notion of neoliberal subjectivity. This is all a bit ambitious. I'm quite sure I won't do a good job of getting to all of this, but let's see what happens. And also, if I don't get it, I'm going to feel very excluded. There might be a tear, I'm not going to lie. All right. I want the one with the happy face. All right, so to give you a bit of a context about institutional psychotherapy, you really have to think about this at the time of World War II and the French resistance. Now, this was really located in a psychiatric hospital in a small village of Saint-Laurent, not far from Lyon. There in the psychiatric hospital, you had two quite important people, Paul Boutt and Lucien Bonafé. When they heard word that in Spain, the so-called red psychiatrist François Tosquet was part of the Catalan resistance to fascism, and he had fled Spain as the resistance crumbled and was living in a refugee center. So Paul Boutt and Lucien Bonafé, they heard of him by reputation, and they managed to bring him on board to Saint-Laurent Hospital. And this kind of trifecta here really formed what would be an amazingly creative group of people. During Nazi occupation and the Vichy regime, Saint-Laurent was a quite remarkable place. As I'm sure many of you know, the Nazis had a program of extermination of so-called degenerates. This included people who were said to be psychologically unwell. People who were in psychiatric hospitals were shipped right to the death camp. Saint-Laurent is quite interesting because none of their patients went to concentration camps, none of their patients went to death camps. Not only that, but during the resistance, the hospital became transformed. Very much so, it became a staging area for the French resistance. Surrealists fled to there, and they ran a surrealist resistance newspaper, in clandestine publication out of the hospital. And what they did here is they very much thought about how can we break down these hospital walls. The only way we can resist occupation is by involving the larger community. Really what this was is the beginning of a very intense form of social therapy, of the blurring of the boundary between the so-called patient and general population. In fact, the entire idea of liberation here becomes very, very resonant. Anyone in France, liberation has a quite powerful meaning because it very much speaks to liberation from occupation, liberation from the death camp, concentration camp system. So then to talk about the kind of psychic liberation of their patients had an immediate resonance with the local population. So they were able to kind of form immediate lines of affinity through this. During the resistance, they formed, my pronunciation is terrible, no matter what language I speak, I sound like a surfer. But it was the Société des Gay-Boudins, which the idea of this society was, and this is explicit, to resist and to create. To resist the concentration camp asylum system. Now this became very important. This is something that someone who joined the hospital later, Jean-Louis, spoke about at depth. That the psychiatric system was very much analogous to the concentration camp system. The treatment of mentally ill is very much analogous to the Nazi system of concentration camps. So they have to resist this system and resist domination by the Vichy government. They have to resist the concentration camp system becoming the new hegemonic norm in their area. The idea that people who might have mental health support needs are in some way degenerate. So you have to resist this kind of impact, where this becomes normalized in discourse. And then they have to create a new therapeutic form in the face of this kind of domination. They have to they have to create a new direction in psychotherapy, a psychotherapy that would be a quote, art of sympathy, that accompanies the patient rather than works against the patient. So very much you have to be very much part of the patient's journey. A lot of this was formed very much by the reading of Psychoanalysis, specifically a very, very young Dr. Lacan. In fact, when Tosquet came from Spain, one of two books he brought with him was a copy of Lacan's PhD on psychosis. I'm blanking out on the other book now, which is quite annoying. But the idea that it had a very close and intricate reading of psychosis became important. In fact, Saint-Laurent very much, not dissimilar to Lacan, was trying to follow this notion that psychosis has to be within the realm of the treated. We can't just focus on neurosis, it has to be psychosis. For those of you who are familiar with this, famously, for psychoanalysts before this moment, psychosis was seen to be beyond the pale. You can't treat psychosis, it's just neurosis. And there's some very interesting kind of quite foundational assumptions up to this point as well in psychoanalysis, namely the notion of the cure, right? This idea of having perfect mental health is a misnomer. Everyone's a bit neurotic. It's just a matter of adjusting the patient's neurosis to kind of fit society's neurosis. Whereas if you form psychosis, that's very much beyond the pale of treatment. That's madness, that's incarceration, that's something that psychoanalysts can't treat. It was Lacan, who also was a psychiatrist to begin with, and started reading psychoanalytic theory. That was the first one to really propose this method for the treatment of psychosis. And this is something that Tosquez took very seriously and took with him to his work in Saint Albin. Now, following the war, you had the introduction of two very young junior doctors, and this is where things got really interesting. You had Jean Uri and Franz Fanon. Franz Fanon came first, in fact, before Jean Uri arrived. Fanon worked very, very closely with Tosquez. They had what can only be described as a very, like a quite intense bond of friendship, really. After Fanon died, Tosquez wrote a very, very beautiful memorial paper to him. Fanon, I'm sure, are many people here familiar with Franz Fanon? Fanon's an interesting one because he's almost always taught wrong. You're either kind of taught Fanon the third world militant, or you're taught Fanon kind of the culture studies approach. Someone like Homi Bhabha really puts forward the Fanon of discourse, the Fanon of black skin, white mask. But these are all very kind of one-dimensional readings of Fanon. Nothing that Fanon did can be divorced from his therapeutic practice, first and foremost. In fact, it's really interesting if you think about his most famous work, The Wretched of the Earth, which was it was Bible. It was for anyone who's a militant. It was literally required reading for the Black Panther Party, for example. So everyone talks about him as the militant of third world liberation. But if you really read Wretched of the Earth, it's a very psychoanalytically. It's there's whole sections on therapy in it. So this reading of him as just a militant is completely inaccurate, as is this kind of reading culture studies that very much drains the politics out. For Fanon, the urgency of politics, especially anti-racist politics, was always, first and foremost in his head. Fanon, a lot of what Fanon took to Saint Albin had already been formed by his experience in med school in Lyon. In fact, it was when he was still in Lyon when he first encountered what was referred to as the North African syndrome. And interestingly, this was not him working as a psychiatrist, this was him working as a medical doctor. He was called in to treat people, largely working class and poor people in slums, really, from North Africa. And they were always complaining of an acute stomach pain. But there's nothing that they can find out is physiologically wrong with them. This is what was termed the North African syndrome, that this acute stomach pain, but yet you couldn't find a physiological source of the pain, of the discomfort. So for Fanon, this is very much a kind of, the stomach pain was a manifestation of living a life deprived of liberty. So here you have a psychosomatic response to having a life very much confined to a slum, in much the same way that the Nazis were confining people to concentration camps, in much the same way that people of color are confined to certain areas. These are all indistinguishable. And there's a psychosomatic response to this. So that very much is the North African syndrome. That this response you have to living a life deprived of liberty. Liberty here became very important. So what you want to do is you want to disalienate and depersonalize the subject. That means, how do you start thinking communally in these projects? And this is something very much that Sanal Ben was focused on. So, they had these experiments where they took the bars off of the windows, they smashed the gates for the hospital. They very much started thinking about how to involve the local community. But it was all very contained within Sanal Ben. It became, in perhaps an Anglo contemporary way of thinking, something not unlike a therapeutic community, the way it was structured. And the doctor-nurse relationship to the patients is not unlike a therapeutic community. So, all with the idea of readjusting people's social relationships, where therapeutic interactions can happen from very basic kind of socialization. Shortly after Fanon left Sanal Ben, well, he had a very kind of uneventful and quite depressing residency in Brittany. But then he went to North Africa, to Algeria, in the Jean-Rousseau Hospital. And that's where, most of us know Fanon from his work there. Now, again, everyone knows about Fanon's time in Algeria as he turned the hospital into a staging area for the FLN, and then became active in the anti-colonial resistance. And that's all true. It's very much modeled after what Sanal Ben did during the occupation. But for me, at least, the really interesting stuff happened alongside of that. And that was, of course, his therapeutic practice. Fanon had, in his charge, initially especially, he was in charge of 2 wards. And Johannesville is a massive, massive complex. It's huge. So, and the wards were very segregated from each other. So Fanon was in charge of the European women, the Pied Noir women, as well as Algerian men. So he right away started instituting the same program that they had at Sanal Ben in Johannesville, this form of social therapy. And the Pied Noir women immediately responded to this, and you started seeing remarkable results straight away. The Algerian men had no response. And what Fanon quickly realized is, how therapeutic is it to put on a Christmas party for a bunch of Muslim men? In a kind of very, very phenomenal way, you know what I mean? And also the fact that very few of the doctors, in fact, none of the doctors when Fanon arrived, spoke Arabic. So they were speaking to them in French or through translators. So you had an immediate translation issue, you had a cultural problem. And the problem with this was the idea of the North African syndrome was very much grafted onto what was happening in Algeria. And in fact, it was called the Algerian School. The Algerian School was something that basically said that Arab men, this is a kind of gross simplification, but for time purposes, it basically said, it read Arab psyche as being inferior to the white psyche, right? It pathologized the position of being non-white and said that they were childlike. So literally, and here it becomes very Foucaultian, right? If any of you know Madison Civilization, the whole idea, the advent of the madman comes through the overlap of multiple regimes of truth. That's the overlap of medicine plus law. That reads people who are quote unquote insane as lacking capacity as a full adult. They're childlike. And that's where the state has the authority to incarcerate you in psychiatric institutions or asylums. So the exact same kind of process was being played out in North Africa. But here you had an entire race basically being pathologized for their position under colonial domination. It's dead Foucaultian if you kind of read it after reading Madness and Civilization. So what Fanon started doing is he started kind of quite immersing himself in local culture and started setting up tea rooms, started creating cultural exchanges that were very much more appropriate, what's often referred to as ethnopsychiatry. And here is when you started having the amazing results with the men there. And of course, part and parcel to this is the problem of colonialism. Because you can't achieve mental health in this colonial system. You can't achieve mental health in a system that at a very phenomenal level denies you recognition as a human. And this is something Fanon was very explicit about. He has a chapter about this where he kind of takes Hegel to task and talks about the Master-Slave Dialectic. This dialectic where, in the kind of Hegel dialectic, you have the master and you have the slave, and they're both kind of vying for power, but at the end, you have a mutual recognition. And again, this is a bit overly simplistic, but for time's sake, that's the summation of it. So for Fanon, this whole notion of recognition is impossible because the master in a colonial setting, the colonizer, doesn't want recognition, nor does the colonizer need recognition from the colonized. They just want their labor. So the entire idea of fulfilling the dialectic, the entire idea of having mutual recognition is foreclosed. As is the possibility of a person of color ever developing the notion of, developing neurosis. For neurosis to develop, you have to have a certain mechanism of internalization. You have to internalize these structures. But for the black man living in an anti-black racist society, there's no possibility for internalization. You quite literally live the racial drama on your skin. Every day on your skin, you live out the racist drama. You can't internalize it. Everything is external. Everything is driven by this kind of destructive drive. Therefore, you have disproportionate diagnosis of psychosis among people of color. Not coincidentally, you still have a disproportionate diagnosis of people of color with psychosis today. Take from that what you will. So, for him, what's the cure then? What's the cure if you live in a system that denies recognition, that denies that forecloses the possibility of internalization of the system, that you live out a psychotic drama every day, just walking through society? So, at the heart of institutional psychotherapy, right, is you take the psychoanalytic principle. You have to adjust the individual to fit society. It's a matter of manipulation of neurosis. But that doesn't work in the colonized situation. That doesn't work in the situation of a person of color living in a racist society. So then, therefore, what could be what's the therapeutic method? Well, you have to politically resist it. That means the only way that you can have a kind of therapeutically informed practice is you have to overthrow colonialism. You have to work against racism. And this means a large-scale political engagement. So this is very much the kind of politics that you get there behind institutional psychotherapy. And then, of course, the history is well known. Fanon finally found his position untenable. He left the hospital, became an outspoken member of the FLN, was wounded in combat, ended up in Tunisia, and this is where he did his most interesting work. I swear to God that dude never slept, because whilst working as an ambassador for the FLN government in exile, he decided to take over another hospital in Tunis, and then opened up Africa's first day center. And here's where he had the most interesting critique of Tosquez. He wrote a paper around this time, actually he wrote it just as he was leaving Algeria, critiquing what they were doing in San Alban. And the problem he had with San Alban is it was too bound up in the hospital. It was too bound up in San Alban. It didn't involve society enough. So for him, one of the great things he kind of did towards the end of his life was the focus on the day center. The focus on therapy now has to happen in the community. You can't cut people from the community, or else the idea of any therapeutic encounters becomes foreclosed. The stigma, everything else keeps reproducing itself. At an ideological level, you can only reproduce, kind of borders here. There's no way to break apart this border or to work against this border. Very, very briefly, one thing you can think about in the way that this idea, especially around recognition, can be brought forward to today, right? Is within neoliberalism, you have this extreme kind of depersonalization, extreme alienation. There's a quite interesting book written from a very Foucault position called The Neoliberal Subject that I take a lot of this from. It's by Julian Reed and David Chandler, where they talk about adaptation, vulnerability, and precarity, right? And resilience, and resilience, as these become the primary factors. And this is something interesting because not necessarily just psychoanalysis, but in mental health in general, you want to talk about how to build resilience. You know, how can you become more resilient in confrontation? But for them, this notion of resilience and adaptivity is ultimately harmful, because you don't want to become resilient and adaptive to a system that's fundamentally violent, to a fundamentally psychotic system. That notion of adaptivity cuts off and forecloses the possibility for political action, political change. It keeps you very much isolated. It keeps you from kind of having a change in the structures of recognition. Somewhat related to that, but I don't really have time to make that explicit connection. One thing that I always think about in this terms, especially around recognition, happened last year in the country where I'm from, around the Standing Rock protests. There, you had an amazing movement of indigenous rights, right? The largest, really, in history in the Americas, of indigenous people resisting domination in Standing Rock on the Sioux Reservation. And this was something really interesting, because here, a lot of white allied liberals got it dead wrong. So what you had at Standing Rock, right? The way a lot of the kind of white liberal commentators talked about it was, why doesn't the US government just respect the treaty rights? We just have to respect the treaty rights. This is in violation of the treaty rights. But this, from a notion of recognition, this is horrible and this is violent. We don't want to respect the treaty rights. Why would you want to respect the rights and have recognition in terms of what is really the first concentration camp system, the reservation system? And if you listen to the discourse of the water protectors, it was never about treaty rights. It was about the common. It was very much this idea of the water and the land as the common. And even, the white folk that went there in support, this is something that a lot of them quickly adapted to their language. It no longer became about treaty rights, but it became about this recognition of the common. So in terms of an ideological recognition, here I think you have a clear division. Those who stayed removed from the political action were thinking in terms of very much an ideological form of recognition that ultimately reproduced a horrible system, a violent system. Whereas those who directly engaged in the political action worked against this kind of ideological recognition, to what I suppose you might refer to as more of a genuine form of recognition. So in terms of what can psychoanalysis do here, a lot of my training is around group processes. I'm a big believer in group forms of process. And for me, it's a matter of how do we think of a lot of the psychoanalytic theory, a lot of the psychoanalytic approach in the group. So it's not a matter of necessarily abandoning psychoanalysis on a one-on-one basis, but thinking about how do these move into a society, how do these move into a community, what are the group processes that we can take from psychoanalysis? And then how then does this carry with it a certain political urgency? Cheers.
Now, amazingly, we are on schedule, which means we have half an hour now for conversation, questions, and discussion. I think to ask questions directly to individual speakers is a good thing. We can have conversations about that. I think it's also good if we have conversations across ways as well, not only directly to kind of back and forth with speakers. So if you have general points or comments and things you want to talk about that didn't come up or did come up, that's good as well. I have a couple of questions, but I'm happy to hold on to them and to start on the floor if anyone has any thoughts or first interjections. Yeah?
Thank you very much for the talk. They were really interesting. This is a question for everybody, but I'll take it out of the last presentation. I think what you described was much with the Fanon's kind of position was a psychoanalytical diagnosis of a politically problematic situation rather than a radical way to do therapy. Because the end game of Fanon's position is non-psychoanalysis. It's not some kind of therapy that aims at that. And I mean, in the final analysis, it seems to me that in a one-on-one situation within an analyst's office, it's not. If the answer is something more largely political, then what follows is that we should leave the office and do something more politically collective. So I don't think that gives a solution to the one-on-one analyst-analysant situation.
Okay, I mean, I suppose I would just say I dead disagree with you. And the reason I disagree with you is because of what he was doing specifically in Tunisia, right? And this is a very kind of common reading of Fanon. He took a psychoanalytic framework to diagnose a problem, but then the answer is only in politics. And I suppose my question then is, at what level does changing a regime or changing a policy or changing something in the political sphere actually readjust social relationships from the bottom up? For Fanon, it didn't. And the reason it didn't, you can see in his experience of Tunisia, right? Tunisia, when he was there, was take the post with a bit of irony, colonial. Nevertheless, a lot of relationships of domination, a lot of kind of psychic forms of repression remain very much intact. For him then, this is why you have to move treatment in all forms outside of the hospital and think about treatment in the community, specifically through day centers. It's not enough just to do politics unless the politics is therapeutically informed, unless there's a form of therapy always accompanying it. And this is very explicit in what he did in Tunisia. And it's interesting if you think about the pushback, because here Fanon, when he first showed up to Charles Nicolle Hospital in Tunis, again, these is staffed by psychiatrists, nurses, doctors, who were very much, Tunisian, very much anti-French colonialism, and all of them hated him. In fact, he got much more resistance from people who should be allies than he did working in the colonial system in Algeria. Because they said, quite literally, they said his ideas were too dangerous, they were too radical. Which I think speaks volumes to the idea that just having a political transformation is only really not even half the job. Then you have to go about readjusting social relationships. And here, it's not an abandoning of psychoanalysis per se, but it's an expanding of the method to the group, what Fanon referred to as social therapy. So again, it's a lot of the psychoanalytic frameworks there, but it's expanded to group processes. So that very much went in tandem to the politics and can't be divorced from the politics.
Yeah?
I would like to ask where, after this trajectory that you mentioned, starting from Saint-Aubin and then to Algeria and Tunisia, where did it go afterwards? Does the Laborde Institute, for example, that Guattari worked in, follow the same tradition? And what do we have now leading such thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a massive history here, and still quite a lot of work being done in this area. There's a moment, and this is actually how I kind of came to a lot of this, is my what seems like a million years ago now, my PhD was on Guattari and Fanon. And I remember reading them and being like, there's so many points of similarity here that was really eerie, and then doing a bit of scratching at the surface, and you find out, not only were they both come out of the same tradition, there was a few months when they were both at Saint-Aubin together. But we all know the Fanon story, but Uri then, with Guattari and Jean-Paul Polak and others, started Laborde. Laborde is still running today, still very much a radical and form of social therapy. It's been a bit chaotic in the last few years since Jean-Louis passed, but it is still running. And this is where, it was really here where the idea of institutional psychotherapy became institutional analysis. and the work that was being done with the Surfy research project, where you had Anne, Kieran, and others join in at Labor, and then think about this outside of psychiatric institutions. So you had a movement from just kind of psychoanalytic framework, a psychotherapeutic framework, to sociology, to urban studies, to creative practices as well. A lot of this, you still have Labor, you still have a lot of therapists, in or around Paris. Jean-Paul Pollock's still somewhat active, although his health is starting to fail a bit now. But you still have like Olivier April, who's very much still involved in this kind of therapeutic framework, practicing there. And it seems as though, and maybe this is because so much of my research with Ed and others here is bound up in these practices, so maybe to me it seems much bigger than it is. But there is a quite recent interest being ignited into this, especially in the Anglophone world. And there's a series of publications coming out soon in both French and English that are looking more seriously at these practices, and there's hopefully going to be movements in this direction.
Can I ask a question to Sally actually about, we've had this conversation about institutions which have done away with traditional psychoanalytic structure of one-on-one relationships and moved towards group and social forms of therapeutic practice. And I was just wondering about, we've had a lot of conversation about that, but we started earlier on talking about Psych's work in Cornwall and the experience there, and I was just wondering how much what you hear potentially converts or doesn't convert to that setting, how much of the conversation around the encounter between working class life and psychoanalytic practice, that encounter might be partly because of the psychoanalytic framework and the maintenance of the one-on-one relationship and that kind of thing. I'd be interested to hear about that.
I think I see it less to do with the one-on-one relationship, but more to do with the kind of technology and subjectivity that a lot of psychoanalytic theory signs up for.
Okay.
That for me is where I would place the problem really at. And I think we're a kind of small nature reserve at the site. If you strange the wider psychoanalytic field, I think a lot of the accounts, I would say they're incredibly middle class, and they're signing up behind very kind of disabling notions for anybody that is outside of middle class life. I would like to think that there's a space for a one-on psychoanalysis that is sort of, that is outside of that technology. And Christ, isn't there a need for that right now with sort of the kind of world we're increasingly living in? Dominion, I've got colleagues dotted about here. So, what do they think?
I was just saying, I think there's a lot of lost history, both in psychoanalysis and in everything that Anthony's been saying, and sort of traditions within psychoanalysis, group and individual. I mean, the Arbor's Philadelphia Association households, which in their heyday, I suppose, had group and individual psychotherapy for people. I mean, I don't know what the class conversation was, but also further back, the history of sort of psychoanalysis vis-a-vis psychosis and neurosis is not just in France. It is in Britain as well, with Winnicott and Boutt in the Second World War groups and so on. But I think it's just lost, but it's revivable. I mean, the ideas and some of what has already happened is there to be, possibly still to be used. Because I wonder. I should think in an urban setting, which you were in, Sally, originally, there's a sort of informal network of patients, and I wonder how that pans out in Cornwall, where people are very much more sort of atomised.
Sorry, Steve, I'm not quite.
Well, I mean, through the clinic, through the referrals you get, people are very isolated, people sort of, economically disenfranchised and so on. It's probably a different situation in many, as you say, there are colleagues here, but there are colleagues here who are patients who talk to each other. I wonder if there's any way or any sort of growing sort of culture there in which, obviously you've got a group of therapists that you've grown there through the training. Is that happening potentially with patients?
I'm sorry, I'm being very dense here, Stephen.
I think there's an informal.
I'm not sure where you're
I think
going.
there's an informal therapeutic culture. I think you've said this yourself before, which more pertains to an urban setting. I wonder, is that beginning to happen in Cornwall?
Well, in a way, my paper wasn't really so much about a kind of psychoanalytic culture. It was really looking at what happens to working class experience, and I would argue that would pertain as much in an urban setting as in a rural setting. Some of the people I was describing, I guess, had very, well, kind of like the rural underclass. But goodness me, I mean, I was saying to Ed when I arrived, we walked through Elephant and Castle, and the forms of deprivation and social isolation I witnessed just through walking here. So it's much more to do with psychoanalysis capacity or not to embrace the diversity of what it is to be a subject in contemporary culture, and I suspect it's doing it very poorly in London as much as maybe they're struggling to do it in Cornwall.
What's interesting too is that that's a common critique of a lot of the French processes. It's like labor is very much isolated, but you don't get a lot of the extreme alienation that you would in Paris, for example, as you in kind of beautiful flowery area where labor is.
My point relates to what Sally was saying about the working class experience. Mark Fisher comes to mind, capitalist realism, who looks at the environmental factors of mental health and the privatisation of mental illness. And I was wondering, can the psychoanalytical frame that focuses on early life experience and is a privatised space in itself fully account for the structural causes for mental illness? If we think of in terms of neoliberalism and the working class don't even match their signifier anymore because there are no working class jobs since Thatcherism and Blairism, etc.
I think that's a very good point. Absolutely, and of course it depends, what version of early life are we looking at, and what class and race and gendered subject is that early life talking about. Psychoanalysis historically has not always been very good at interrogating, supporting its own sort of class and race assumptions.
Yeah, I was thinking about the question of do we working in London, and I'm at the site as well, so I guess we're working in the same project in different parts of this country. But I mean, I was really struck when I was talking with two young women from a different psychotherapeutic background, young meaning 30-ish, 40-ish, so established in their practice, but with a different political history than I've had, because I'm older. But, and they asked me, but if I'm a psychoanalyst, why can I also talk about group processes? And I was thinking, but that's very much part of my training, that we do talk about beyond, and we talk about sociology and psychosocial theory at the site so much. And I was wondering if there's something about the discourse we're creating at the site, which we ought to be more open about and much stronger about. And I was also thinking about the overlap between our private practices and our group-based practices. I'm particularly thinking of the Psychosis Project where I work, where we sit around and have cups of teas with the members of the project. We encourage them to use the art room and the music room and so forth, as well as the individual psychotherapy which they have. and how that relates sometimes to the way I listen to my analysis in my private practice, where one woman from a working class rural background with multiple generations of immigration was talking about being in a shared office with some other people and feeling totally alienated by that. And the difficulty I had in introducing some sociological terms with her, because she, I wasn't there to teach her, but at the same time, if I use some sociological language in my interpretation, she might pick up on it and argue back with me and build something cognitive as well as emotional in the therapy. And I think it's important we do that.
Two things come to my mind. I think it's increasingly more difficult because I would say that any sense of the social has now been individualised. But the other point, of course, is the moment we speak, as Butler was really clear on this, we become a social theorist. Just because we're only speaking to one other person doesn't mean we're not already talking and commenting on an entire kind of world in which we inhabit. So, and I'd say that that goes on in the privacy of the consortium. We're everywhere.
One right at the back here.
You mentioned about how the technologies operate, excluding working class, and you mentioned about, say, not doesn't have a psychotherapeutic mind or something. I was wondering if you mention any other specific examples of that technologies, ways that operates in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, but also to use the expression, how do you decolonize that in practical terms, and also be extended maybe to psychiatry and problems there, being the working class.
Is a question just to me?
The
last bit, right. Okay, well, I have to listen again, sorry. So what was the last bit again?
To use the expression decolonize, how do we, it's inbuilt, these kind of, these value judgments, these presumptions, these quite aggressive terms such as, impoverished, that's not critically understood what that also implies.
Well, I mean, in my research on mental health activism, one of the main objectives really is to see how you can resist the dominant idea that mental disorder or madness is a disorder or a dysfunction or illness of the mind, and to kind of try and give alternative narratives, different stories that you can tell about this kind of experience, this kind of phenomena. So the idea of decolonizing psychiatry sort of from the inside, I think that's going to be very difficult. At the moment, there is a lot of confrontation between psychiatrists who want the diagnostic system, the DSM, as it is, and critical psychologists who are trying to put forward different frameworks to make sense of all this. You might have heard something called the power threat meaning framework, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and it was huge sort of arguments and fighting on social media over whether it's a valid framework or not. So I think it comes from both directions. It comes from critical practitioners, most of whom will be psychologists, and from activists themselves trying to give different narratives, like the different narratives around hearing voices, for instance, and different narratives around bipolar disorder, the idea of the dangerous gift, which is the Icarus project is popularizing. So this is how it can go. But psychiatry is still really trying to refine its diagnostic categories. They're still trying to invest money in, on research for biomarkers and functional imaging, because it's a medical specialty. And either they're going to redefine themselves radically to survive, or it's not clear what the future will be of psychiatry.
Yeah, one here.
Right. I'm wondering about Mohammed's sort of question, I guess, is about to what extent do analysts bring in oppression if the patient doesn't think it's important to them? And your example that you have is quite subtle, really, but sometimes it's a lot less subtle than that, and we think it's really obvious. So I'm thinking for Fanon, it probably was really obvious that colonial oppression was everywhere. He didn't really have to convince people that were being oppressed that, hey, you know, look, you've got the oppressors. But I imagine, but it might be more subtle than that. But nowadays, it seems that, in particular with class oppression, like you were saying, Sally, that, you know, if you don't succeed, it's because you're not working hard enough. So here it's more subtle to, you know, do you bring it in or not? So I'm wondering, I guess my question ultimately is to Sally really, but to the others as well. To what extent do we bring it in you know, nowadays, and whether you do in your experience?
Well, I think all analysts should have a very kind of clear sense of the contemporary field of class. So it should be something that's within their thinking. And one of the things I'm very interested in is the kind of, you know, surely psychoanalysis should be the place where one can help people understand that they're basically kind of signing up for a regime that is right against their economic self-interest. You know, if you can't do that in the clinic, where can you do it? But that's become such a normalised part of the wider social life that, you know, it's difficult to do. But I would say that could be where a kind of radical clinical encounter could take place.
Can I make a point, a comment on So it's an excellent point you're making. You know, the difference between people who just need to be told, alerted to the fact that, you know, there is a particular problem which they already can see and are suffering from, and on the other extreme where you need to go much further than this. You know, you need to, in a sense, deconstruct something in their understanding to bring to light that there is a problem. I think I have more of a problem with that, because of the responsibility that comes with this kind of deconstruction at a social level. It does cause harm as well to, in a sense, disenfranchise people from their understanding of their own sense of well-being. And it's a very difficult line to draw sometimes. I mean, you see it in revolutions as well, like when some kind of framework is brought to liberate people, if you like, and ends up manifesting in really terrible directions. I'm thinking of the Arab Spring, for instance, what democracy did to Egypt. You know, it was well intentioned, but it didn't really work out very well. So yes, it's a really good point to be aware of this distinction.
Can I ask you a question about the use of the word "we"? Because through your paper, you were saying, what do we do when we're in a position where we think this individual has a problem? And there's like an assumed kind of, maybe we, the psychoanalytic community, or we, the psychiatric community, and we're there as an individual. But I guess the assumed we there is dangerous because that we is power relation. So for example, you might assume a different we and say, should we tell psychiatrists that they're caught in this ideology which is damaging them? But that never happens because that power relation is not there. So I don't know, maybe coming at the problem a different way and not assuming the relation of the we to the individual might allow you to think it through, not as this kind of block, like either we act or we don't, but maybe we change who the we is.
No, but by we I mean I. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a really good point. I think in this context, I simply mean it is in a sense a problem. It is in a sense a problem that we're trying to work out. Some partly analytically, partly critically, partly by looking at the history. So I really mean it simply as the group of individuals who are thinking about the problem in an analytic sense and trying to work it out. I don't mean anything more than that. I don't mean a particular social group.
So those things probably do a lot.
It's kind of a way of talking as opposed to clear determination of this is who we are and we're deciding upon the fate of these people over there. It's sort of, I don't mean it like that, but it perhaps could come across.
Yeah. For this one, maybe one other one, then we're going to probably have to slowly bring it to a close.
Yeah, it's a question for Sally. Just in terms of what you were saying about the clinic in Cornwall, I can obviously see that extreme social and economic degradation would make it very difficult for people to find this space to engage with psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. But I don't see that as being in itself a critique of psychoanalytic thinking, because if I think about the work of Zachary Davis about internal racism, it may not be in its work, that sort of work is not being done a lot, but it is being done, about trying to think about looking into the individual and what are our prejudices, and how people relate to their prejudices, and the fact that prejudice is universal and serves a psychic function. I feel like psychoanalysis is good at thinking about itself. And obviously there's a problem with the fact that, most psychoanalysts or psychotherapists are white middle class, but that doesn't in itself mean that the practice and the thinking is not able to think beyond those boundaries.
Really? That's not been my experience. I haven't got much more time.
Yep, there's one here.
I just had a kind of response to the last speaker. The narrative which reminded me very much of the kind of problem of that confronted a group called the UK Palestine Mental Health Network, who were thinking about how to act in solidarity and support mental health workers and the general Palestinian cause in the context of apartheid and separate claims. And it often, although they explored trying to support mental health networks in Palestine itself, in the West Bank, they often resolved the kind of that they encountered these kind of problems about resilience and how to function all the time, and it often resulted in a kind of going out into the political and thinking about how people in mental health situations are kind of challenging their own complicity and their own organisational complicity in the system, like challenging conferences that they're supporting BDS. So that's
I mean, if you were to think about, from what I was talking about, the notion of institutional analysis or institutional psychotherapy, if you're going to kind of boil down this set of practices to one guiding ethos, is that an institution can't act therapeutically without first and foremost having a critique of itself as an institution and thinking about how this institution functions in relation to other institutions. So very much so, like for an institution to work, it very much has to be aware of how it's situated within the community, what are the power dynamics it's perhaps, propping up, and all of this, absolutely.
How does the site respond to that then, as an institution?
I guess that doesn't need to be directly to Sally, but there are lots of side members in this room as well, so I don't know if anybody wants to.
I think we're quite a sort of lively and conflictual organisation.
Yes.
Would we say that?
Absolutely. I was discussing this with somebody yesterday. I think some people find the experience of being in the site conflictual, like you said, but I think it's, which is not always comfortable, but it's regarded as being part of the nature of the beast.
Is there, for example, any concession towards low-cost training? I believe it's the cheapest training there is.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think
Cheapest we know.
is
For thought out reasons. I mean, it doesn't just happen that way. And I think I've always understood that it's been a conscious decision of the organisation to make it as affordable as possible, but which is still not very affordable.
It's not very affordable though.
But by comparison,
But that's not a useful.
I'm afraid it's the best we can do.
Psychoanalysis in theory is a fairly serious middle class fortification, theoretically speaking. To mobilise in the clinic in a useful and radical way, it really isn't easy to get the cogwheels to join up in a clinical sense. It's very resistant to that. It's a very resistant theory, if you like, really to practice in the way that we've been talking.
If I may draw your attention to the fact that you are at Elephant Castle, as Sally said, is a very difficult landscape. I moved here 7 years ago, 10 actually, and we decided with a very small community to resuscitate really this place which was about to be demolished. The site has been amazing in supporting this place, and no other organization has been so important to Draper Hall like the site for their commitment to bring here discourses and conferences to this level. So I think this is priceless, their commitment.
But maybe the challenge is to think both things alongside each other. But I think your comment's absolutely valid. Why isn't there supporting of low cost? And that is a valid, absolutely valid critique. Alongside society supporting this site, and there isn't allowing for conflict. So we need to have both positions.
Yes.
On that note, I think we are at 5:05, so we've been here for 2 hours or more. Let's say a final thank you, I think, to our speakers as well.